The planet Verdana 4 was a green and golden world that sat on the very edge of what the Galactic Council called civilized space, and the humans who lived there loved it more than they could say in words. 12,000 of them had made this place their home over the last 9 years, building farms and houses and schools across the wide river valleys where the soil was rich and the air tasted sweet like rain on warm stone. Director Senna Okoye stood on the balcony of the colony's administration building every morning and watched the sun come up over the eastern ridge, and every morning she felt the same quiet pride swell in her chest, because this place was proof that humanity could build something beautiful, even this far from Earth. The children were always the first sign that a colony was truly alive, and Verdana 4 had 400 of them now, running through the streets and laughing in the school complex, and getting mud on their clothes in ways that drove their parents half mad with frustration and half mad with love. Kyth Soratal did not understand the children at all. He was an Aori, tall and thin, with silver-blue skin and 4 eyes that blinked in pairs, and he had been assigned to Verdana 4 as the Galactic Council's official liaison officer 3 years ago, and in that time he had learned a great deal about humans, but almost nothing that made sense. He watched them from the observation deck of the small diplomatic quarters they had built for him near the colony center, and he recorded his observations in the personal journal he kept for what he hoped would someday become a proper xenological study. "The humans sing to their young," he wrote one evening after watching a mother carry her sleeping daughter through the market square, humming a melody that had no apparent purpose or function. "They tell them stories about things that never happened and places that do not exist. And when a child falls and injures itself, even slightly, the nearest adult drops whatever they are doing and rushes to comfort it as though the entire world has come apart." He found it fascinating and slightly absurd. The Aori raised their young in communal learning halls where efficiency and education were the only priorities, and the idea of singing a child to sleep was as alien to Kyth as breathing underwater. But he liked the humans, truly he did. Warm and generous, and they always invited him to their gatherings, even though he could not eat their food and did not understand most of their jokes. And Director Okoye had once told him that he was family now, and he had spent 3 days trying to figure out what that meant, because he was clearly not related to any of them by blood or bond. Most of the galaxy saw humans as a curiosity. They were relatively new to the interstellar stage, having only achieved faster-than-light travel about 200 years ago, spread quickly but quietly across a few dozen star systems, without making much of a fuss about it. The Galactic Council classified them as a cooperative mid-tier civilization, which meant they were considered friendly and productive, but not particularly powerful or threatening. Other species sometimes mocked them behind closed doors for their emotional nature and their obsession with their offspring. And the general consensus among the older civilizations was that humans were soft and sentimental, and would never amount to much in a galaxy that respected strength above all else. Kyth had believed this too, once. He was not so sure anymore, but he could not yet explain why. 3 systems away from Verdana 4, the UES Revenant cruised through the darkness between stars on a routine patrol that its crew found deeply boring. Captain Marin Ashcroft sat in her command chair and read reports that had nothing interesting in them, and drank coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and thought about the letter her daughter had sent her from the Academy on Mars. Ashcroft was 46 years old, with short dark hair, and eyes the color of iron, and she had served in the United Earth Navy for 23 years without ever firing a shot in anger. And she was perfectly happy with that record, because she had joined the Navy to protect people, and protecting people did not always require violence. Her crew of 312 respected her because she was calm and fair, and because she never asked anyone to do something she would not do herself. and they trusted her, because in every drill and every simulation, she made decisions that put lives first and glory nowhere. The Revenant was a rapid response frigate, fast and well-armed, but not built for prolonged fleet combat. And Ashcroft ran her ship the way she ran her life, with quiet discipline and an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Everything was about to change. Far away, in a region of space that the Galactic Council preferred not to think about too often, the Zarathi Dominion was on the move. The Zarathi were a reptilian species with scaled hides the color of dark iron and eyes like molten copper, and they had built their empire on conquest and subjugation over the last 1,000 years, swallowing smaller civilizations and grinding them into servitude. They were not subtle, and they were not kind, and they did not pretend to be either of those things. Warlord Draxen Vel stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Teeth of Supremacy, and studied the holographic map of the border territories with the slow satisfaction of a predator choosing its next meal. Verdana 4 glowed like a small green jewel on the edge of the display. A human farming settlement, his intelligence officer reported. 12,000 civilians, minimal military presence, no orbital defenses worth mentioning. Rich agricultural output that could supply 3 of our forward bases. Draxen Vel's mouth stretched into something that was not quite a smile. And the Galactic Council's response if we take it? He asked. Protests, the officer said. Formal condemnations, perhaps sanctions that will expire in a cycle or two. The humans are not a priority species, and the Council will not risk a wider conflict over a single border colony. Draxen Vel nodded slowly, because this was what he had expected, and what he had counted on. The galaxy respected strength, and the humans had never shown any. He gave the order, and the Zarathi fleet moved. On Verdana 4, the sun was setting, and the children were coming home from school when the sky changed. It happened all at once, a deep shuddering hum that vibrated through the ground and rattled the windows, and made every bird on the planet go silent at the same moment. Director Okoye was in her office when the lights flickered and the communications console went dead. Not just offline, but dead in a way that meant something was actively killing every signal on the planet. She walked to the window and looked up and saw them. Dozens of dark shapes descending through the clouds like iron rain. Zarathi dropships falling toward the colony with the terrible patience of things that knew they could not be stopped. The colony's emergency sirens began to wail, and people started running, and somewhere a child screamed, and the sound cut through everything else like a knife through silk. Okoye turned from the window, and her face was steady, even though her hands were shaking, and she grabbed the emergency radio, the old analog one that could not be jammed because it did not rely on digital signals. And she spoke clearly and firmly to everyone who could hear her. Get the children underground, right now. Do not stop, do not wait, do not look back. Get the children underground. Sky above Verdana 4 went dark with ships, and the longest night the colony had ever known began. The Zarathi came down on Verdana 4 like a hammer falling on glass, and the glass broke exactly the way everyone knew it would. The colony's militia was brave but small, just 200 men and women with light weapons and no armor, and no training for the kind of war that was landing on their doorstep. And they fought anyway, because that is what humans do when their homes are threatened, even when the math says they cannot win. They held the eastern bridge for almost 3 hours, pouring fire into the advancing Zarathi columns, and pulling wounded fighters back, and sending them to the medical station, and then going back to the line to fight some more. And when the bridge finally fell, there were only 40 of them left standing, and every single one of them had to be physically dragged away from the position, because not one of them wanted to stop. It did not matter. The Zarathi had 3,000 soldiers on the ground by nightfall, and more arriving every hour. By the time the second sun rose over Verdana 4, the colony belonged to Warlord Draxen Vel. Director Okoye was captured in the administration building, where she had refused to leave because she was still coordinating evacuation efforts over the analog radio. And when the Zarathi dragged her out into the plaza, she did not beg and she did not cry, and she looked Draxen Vel in the eyes with a steadiness that made several of his officers uncomfortable, though none of them would ever admit it. "You are the leader of this settlement," Draxen Vel said, looking down at her from his full height, which was nearly 8 feet of scaled muscle and armored hide. "I am," Okoye said. "Then you will instruct your people to cooperate, and they will be allowed to live as laborers under Dominion authority. Resist, and we will make examples." Okoye said nothing, because she knew that cooperating and resisting would both end in suffering, and the only difference was the speed. Adults were separated into labor groups and put to work immediately, clearing land and building structures for the Zarathi garrison. And the ones who moved too slowly were struck, and the ones who spoke out were put in isolation pits dug into the hard ground at the edge of the colony. But the worst of it, the thing that would echo across the galaxy like a scream that never stopped, was what they did with the children. The Zarathi did not understand human children. Their own young were hatched in batches of hundreds and raised in creche pits where the weak were culled and the strong were trained, and individual attachment between parent and offspring was considered a defect of lesser species. When Draxen Vel's soldiers found the school complex where nearly 300 children had been hidden in the basement levels, they did not see young people who needed protection. They saw small, weak creatures that made a lot of noise and could be useful. School into a holding facility. The children were put in cages made from cargo containers that had been welded shut, except for small openings at the top for air, and they were given food once a day, a nutrient paste that was designed for Zarathi metabolisms and made the human children sick. And when they cried, the guards banged on the containers to frighten them into silence. A girl named Lily, who was 7 years old, and who had been in the middle of a painting when the invasion began, asked one of the guards when she could see her mother. And the guard struck the container so hard it left a dent, and Lily did not ask again. A boy named Marcus, who was 12 and the tallest child in the school, tried to organize the older kids to share food with the younger ones. And when a Zarathi officer found out, he dragged Marcus out and beat him in front of the others as a lesson about the cost of leadership among the conquered. The Zarathi guards found the whole thing. They could not understand why the adult humans in the labor camps became so frantic and so desperate when they learned what was happening to their children. And they laughed at the way human parents screamed and fought and had to be restrained when they tried to reach the school complex. Because to the Zarathi, this attachment was pathetic and proof that humans were exactly the soft emotional creatures the galaxy believed them to be. They were wrong about that, in ways they could not begin to imagine. Deep beneath the colony, in the water treatment tunnels that ran under every major building, Kyth Sorital was alive, and he was watching everything. The Aori liaison had been in the underground maintenance hub when the invasion began, running a routine check on the colony's water recycling systems, because he had volunteered for the task after Director Okoye mentioned they were short-staffed, and the thickness of the rock and metal above him had shielded him from the Zarathi scanners. He sat in the darkness, surrounded by humming pipes and flickering maintenance screens, and he watched through the security cameras that were still connected to the underground network. And what he saw made his silver-blue skin go pale in a way that his species associated with profound horror. He watched the children being caged, and he watched them being frightened, and he watched the small girl with paint on her fingers get screamed at by a creature 10 times her size. And something shifted inside Kyth that he did not have a word for in any of the 7 languages he spoke. But more than horror, he felt something else, a cold, creeping awareness that sat in his stomach like a stone. He had lived among humans for 3 years, and he had studied them and eaten with them and listened to their stories, and he knew something that Warlord Draxen Vel did not know and might never understand until it was far too late, became when you hurt their children. It was not rage the way other species experienced rage, hot and temporary and easily exhausted. It was something deeper and older and far more terrifying, a fury that went all the way down to the bedrock of what it meant to be human. A fury that did not burn out because it was not fueled by anger, but by love. And love in humans was not a gentle thing when it was threatened. It was a force that could crack worlds open. Kyth moved through the tunnels with the careful silence of someone who understood that he might be the only free person left on the entire planet. And he gathered parts from maintenance lockers and equipment storage rooms, cables and circuit boards, and a cracked subspace transceiver that had been marked for recycling. He was not an engineer, but he was smart and he was desperate, and desperation has a way of making things possible that should not be. It took him 11 hours to build something that could send a single short-range subspace burst. Not a message, really, more like a scream compressed into a data packet and fired into the dark, in the hope that someone somewhere would hear it. He could not fit much into the burst, just the colony's identification code and a distress flag, and 3 words that he chose with the care of someone who understood that the right words at the right moment could change everything. Children in danger. He sent it, and the makeshift transmitter burned out immediately, and the tunnel went dark. And Kyth sat there in the blackness, breathing hard, and hoping that it had been enough. The burst traveled at superluminal speeds through the subspace layer, bouncing off relay buoys that the Galactic Council had placed throughout the region. And by sheer luck, or perhaps by something more than luck, it reached a buoy that was still connected to the human military communication network. The buoy did what it was designed to do and routed the packet to the nearest registered human vessel. 3 systems away, the UES Revenant was cruising through the dark between stars, when a communications officer named Lieutenant Priya Sharma frowned at her console, because a priority alert had just appeared that she had never seen before in her 6 years of service. She read the colony identification code and cross-referenced it, and confirmed it was Verdana IV, a civilian agricultural settlement on the frontier. She read the distress flag and felt her pulse quicken. She read the 3 words and felt the blood drain from her face so fast that the officer sitting next to her asked if she was all right. Priya did not answer him. She stood up, and she walked, and then she ran to Captain Ashcroft's quarters, and she pressed the emergency chime, and when the door opened she handed her captain the datapad without a word, because she did not trust her voice. Captain Marin Ashcroft read the 3 words, "Twist in grief," and it did not contort in shock. It went completely and absolutely still, like the surface of a lake in the moment before a storm. And her eyes, which were the color of iron, became something harder than iron, something that did not have a name in any language, but that every human who has ever lived would recognize on sight. She picked up the ship-wide communicator, and her voice was calm and even, and colder than the space between galaxies. "All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. All departments report combat readiness in 15 minutes. The Revenant woke up like a beast that had been sleeping, and 312 humans began to prepare for war. Captain Marin Ashcroft stood in the Combat Information Center of the UES Revenant, and made a decision that would change the shape of the galaxy. She did not make it slowly, and she did not make it with doubt, because there was no room for either of those things when children were in cages, and every second spent thinking was a second those children spent suffering. She turned to her executive officer, Commander David Rowe, and said 5 words that he would remember for the rest of his life. "Activate the Hearthfire protocol." Rowe stared at her for 2 full seconds, which was the longest pause anyone had ever seen from him. And then he nodded once and turned to the communication station, and began entering authorization codes that had been sealed in the Revenant's classified database since the day the ship was commissioned. Hearthfire was not a battle plan. It was not a strategy, or a contingency, or a set of tactical guidelines. Promise. It had been written into the United Earth Navy's founding charter 200 years ago by people who understood something fundamental about their species, that there were certain lines that if crossed would unleash a response so total and so absolute that no calculation of cost or benefit or diplomatic consequence could restrain it. The protocol had one trigger condition, and only one: confirmed harm to human children by a foreign power. In 200 years of interstellar civilization, it had never been activated, not once, because no species had ever been foolish enough or ignorant enough to cross that line. Until now. The moment Commander Rowe entered the final authorization code, the protocol began to cascade outward at the speed of light through every subspace relay and communication network that the United Earth Navy operated. Every human warship within 30 light-years received the signal simultaneously, a Priority 1 alert that overrode every other order and every other mission and every other consideration. Reserve fleets that had been sitting in orbital dockyards for years powered up their engines. Shore leave was canceled across 2 entire sectors, and personnel were recalled from bars and restaurants and beds and told to report immediately. Retired officers received emergency notices on personal communicators they had not checked in decades, and every single one of them answered. Civilian transport ships were requisitioned under wartime authority and began loading Marines and equipment. The human military machine, which the galaxy had always believed was modest and unremarkable, began to move, and the scale of what was moving was something that no alien intelligence service had ever predicted, because humans had been very quiet and very careful about exactly how much power they had built in the dark spaces between their worlds. At the Galactic Council headquarters, a vast station, orbiting a neutral star in the heart of civilized space, the alien diplomats noticed something strange. The human delegation, which was normally the loudest and most sociable group in the building, had gone silent. Ambassador Claire Fontaine, who was known for her warm smile and her habit of bringing baked goods to interspecies meetings, stood up in the middle of a trade negotiation without saying a word, and she walked out. Within the hour, every human diplomat, aide, translator, and support staff had vacated the station, their offices emptied, and their quarters cleared, and their departure so swift and so coordinated that it felt less like a withdrawal and more like a warning. The Aori Diplomatic Corps was the first to react, because they had the most experience with humans, and because Kyth's distress signal had been partially intercepted by their own intelligence networks. Senior Ambassador Felvon contacted a human colleague named James Whitfield, who he had known for 15 years, and who he considered a genuine friend, and he asked him directly what was happening. Whitfield's response came through the comm channel in a voice that Felvon did not recognize, flat and empty and stripped of every trace of the warmth that had defined their friendship. "They hurt our children." Felvon felt his 4 eyes blink rapidly, which was an involuntary Aori stress response, and he asked what that meant in strategic terms, what the humans intended to do, and how the council should respond. There was a pause, and then Whitfield said, "It means there will be no negotiation," and closed the channel. Felvon sat in his office for a long time after that, staring at the dead screen, and feeling something cold move through him. Across the council station, other species were beginning to react as well, each according to their own nature and their own understanding of what was happening. The Kethrali, who were an insectoid hive species that communicated through chemical signals, began sealing their diplomatic quarters and broadcasting neutrality declarations, because their collective intelligence had calculated the threat level and decided that the safest place to be was as far from the situation as possible. The Voronoi, who were energy beings that experienced time differently than biological species, and who generally found physical conflicts boring, began paying attention for the first time in decades, because something in the pattern of events was triggering recognition algorithms that they associated with extinction-level phenomena. And the Tolari, who were the oldest and most scholarly species in the known galaxy, did something that they almost never did. They opened the deep archives. The Tolari had been studying other civilizations for over 50,000 years, and their xenological records were the most comprehensive collection of knowledge about sentient species that had ever existed. And somewhere in those records was a file on humanity that had been compiled over the last 2 centuries with the patient thoroughness that the Tolari applied to everything. Elder historian Kaumesh sat in the archive chamber, surrounded by floating data crystals, and pulled up the human file and began to read with the specific intention of understanding what was about to happen. He read about human history, about how they had fought wars over their children that lasted generations, about how human parents had lifted impossible weights and walked through fire and faced certain death without hesitation when their young were threatened, about how entire nations had mobilized and entire economies had been redirected and entire philosophies of mercy and restraint had been abandoned the moment children were harmed. He read about a concept that humans called the mama bear instinct, and then he read about what happened when that instinct scaled up to the level of an entire civilization with faster-than-light warships and weapons that could crack the crusts of planets. Kaumesh closed the file and sat in silence for a moment, and then turned to his colleague, a younger Tolari named Kyth, who was watching him with obvious curiosity. "The Zarathi are already dead," Kaumesh said quietly. "They simply do not know it yet." Kyth asked what they should do. "Nothing," Kaumesh replied. "There is nothing to do. There is nothing anyone can do. The humans have been provoked in the one way that removes all limits and all restraints and all willingness to listen to reason. We can only watch and record and make sure that every civilization in the galaxy understands what happened here so that no one is ever foolish enough to do it again." Meanwhile, on Verdana 4, Warlord Draxen Vel knew nothing of this. He stood in the colony's captured administration building, which he had claimed as his command post, and he drafted a report to the Dominion High Command, announcing the successful seizure of a human frontier world with minimal Zarathi casualties. He expected commendation and perhaps a promotion, and he was already thinking about which colony to take next, because the humans had proven to be even softer than he had anticipated, and their worlds were rich and poorly defended. He did not check his long-range sensors, because he saw no reason to. Who would come for a small farming colony on the edge of nowhere? The answer to that question was already screaming through subspace toward him at speeds that his instruments could barely detect. At the edge of the Verdana system, far beyond the orbit of the outermost planet, the fabric of normal space began to distort. A Zarathi sensor officer on the orbital monitoring station noticed the readings first, a gravitational anomaly that appeared on his screen as a small ripple, then a larger ripple, then a spike that went off the top of his scene. He recalibrated his instruments because he assumed there was a malfunction. The readings got worse. A second distortion appeared next to the first, then a third, then a fourth, then a dozen, then dozens more, each one larger than the last, each one pulsing with the unmistakable energy signature of ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel. The sensor officer stared at his screen and felt something move through his body that his species barely had a word for, a cold tightening in the muscles and a sudden desperate desire to be somewhere very far away. The Zarathi did not experience fear the way most species did, because their culture had spent 1,000 years breeding it out of them. But in that moment, the sensor officer came as close to pure terror as any Zarathi had come in living memory. He opened a channel to the surface with hands that were not quite steady, and he said the words that would begin the end of everything Draxen Vel had built. Warlord. We are detecting massive FTL signatures at the system boundary. Hundreds of them. They are human. They came out of the dark, like something the universe had been holding back. And when they arrived, the stars themselves seemed to flinch. 214 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, in a formation so precise that the gaps between them could have been measured with a ruler. And at the center of that formation sat a ship so massive that the Zarathi sensor arrays initially classified it as a small moon, before the targeting computers corrected themselves. The UES Wrath of Cradles was a dreadnought, the largest class of warship that humanity had ever built, and its name was not a metaphor or a poetic flourish, but a statement of intent so clear that it needed no translation in any language. The ship was 3 kilometers long and bristling with weapons that the Galactic Council did not know humans possessed, because humans had never had a reason to show them before. And on its hull, in letters tall enough to be read from orbit, was the emblem of the United Earth Navy, and beneath it, a phrase in the oldest human military tradition: "We remember, we come." Fleet Admiral Helena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Wrath of Cradles and looked at the tactical display that showed the Zarathi positions around Verdana 4, and she felt nothing that she would describe as anger, because anger was too small a word for what was moving through her. She was 61 years old, and she had commanded fleets in exercises and simulations and peacekeeping operations for 30 years. And she had a reputation for being methodical and patient, and willing to find diplomatic solutions to problems that other officers wanted to solve with missiles. None of that mattered now. She had seen the intelligence packet that had been compiled during the fleet's transit to the Verdana system, sensor data and intercepted Zarathi communications, and the footage that Kyth had managed to smuggle out through the maintenance camera network. She had watched a 7-year-old girl with paint on her fingers get terrorized by a creature that outweighed her by a factor of 20. Admiral Vasquez opened a fleet-wide channel, and her voice was steady and calm, and carried the weight of something that went far beyond military authority. "All ships, this is Admiral Vasquez. You know why we are here. You have seen what was done. There will be one communication with the enemy, and then we begin. Hold formation until my order." On the surface of Verdana 4, Warlord Draxen Vel received the sensor report, and for the first time since the invasion began, he felt something shift in the certainty that had carried him through his career. 200 ships was not a response. It was a statement. He had brought 37 vessels to take Verdana 4, because 37 was more than enough for a soft civilian world. And now he was looking at a force that outnumbered him almost 6-1, and the flagship, at its center, was larger than anything the Zarathi Dominion had ever built. But Draxen Vel had not become a warlord by surrendering at the first sign of difficulty, and he still believed that humans were fundamentally weak creatures who could be bargained with and manipulated, because that was what soft species did when faced with hard choices. He opened a communication channel to the human fleet, and he put on his most commanding voice, and he made what he believed was a reasonable offer. "Human Commander, I am Warlord Draxen Vel of the Zarathi Dominion. Verdana 4 is now Dominion territory, by right of conquest. However, I am willing to release a portion of the civilian population in exchange for territorial recognition and a non-aggression commitment from your government. This is a generous offer, and I suggest you consider it carefully." The channel was silent for 8 seconds. Then Captain Ashcroft's voice came through, because Admiral Vasquez had given her the honor of delivering the response. And Ashcroft spoke with a calm that was worse than any threat, because it left no room for anything except exactly what she meant. "You touched our children. There are no terms." The channel closed. Draxen Vel stood on his command deck and stared at the dead screen, and in that moment something cracked in his understanding of the universe, a small fracture that would widen into a chasm before the day was done. The battle began 9 seconds later. The human fleet moved with a coordination that the Zarathi had never encountered in any of their 1,000 years of conquest. Every ship knowing its role, and every weapon firing at exactly the right moment, and every maneuver executed with a precision that suggested the humans had been practicing for this specific scenario, even though they could not possibly have known it would happen. The Zarathi fought back, because fighting was all they knew, and their ships were strong, and their weapons were powerful, and their warriors were brave in the way that predators are brave when they have never been prey. But this was different. Human ships took hits that should have crippled them, and kept firing. Damage control teams sealing breaches and rerouting power, and jury-rigging systems with a creativity that bordered on madness. And the ships that could no longer fight under their own power were towed behind the line by their sister ships and continued to fire from there. Human pilots flew their strike craft so close to the Zarathi warships that the point defense systems could not track them, threading through gaps in the armor plating and delivering payloads directly into engine cores and weapon systems with a reckless precision that the Zarathi targeting computers literally could not predict, because no rational species would fly that close to certain death. But the humans were not operating on rationality. They were operating on something older and deeper, and far more dangerous. And every pilot, and every gunner, and every marine who suited up for boarding operations carried with them the knowledge of what had been done to the children of Verdana 4. And that knowledge was a fuel that did not burn out. The Zarathi fleet began to break apart within the first 2 hours. Ships that tried to flee were run down by human frigates that pushed their engines past every safety limit. And ships that tried to surrender were boarded and secured with a cold efficiency that gave no comfort. And the flagship Teeth of Supremacy found itself surrounded by 6 human heavy cruisers that pounded it from every angle until its shields collapsed and its weapons went silent. But the fleet battle was only half of the operation. On the surface of Verdana 4, the second phase began. They were called the Hearthguard, and they were the most elite special operations force that humanity had ever created. And they existed for one purpose. Only one purpose: the recovery and protection of human children in hostile territory. Every member of the Hearthguard was a volunteer, and every one of them had passed selection criteria so demanding that the washout rate was 97%. And the ones who made it through were not just the strongest or the fastest or the most skilled, but the ones who could hold a frightened child in one arm and a weapon in the other, and know with absolute certainty which one mattered more. They came down from orbit in drop pods that screamed through the atmosphere like falling stars. 60 operators in black armor hitting the ground around the school complex in a pattern that had been calculated to the meter. Sergeant First Class Amara Diallo was the first through the door. She had been in the Hearthguard for 9 years, and she had trained for exactly this scenario more times than she could count. And when she breached the outer wall of the school complex and saw the cargo, containers that had been converted into cages, she felt something rise in her chest that she controlled with the discipline of a decade of training, but that she would never forget for as long as she lived. The Zarathi guards inside the complex had been stationed there because it was considered an easy posting, watching over small defenseless creatures that posed no threat. And they were wholly and completely unprepared for what came through the walls. The Hearthguard moved through the building like a wave through sand, precise and unstoppable. Every corner cleared, and every threat neutralized, with a speed that left no room for the Zarathi to organize or respond, or even fully understand what was happening to them. It was over in 14 minutes. Sergeant Diallo found the main holding area where the youngest children had been kept. A dark space that smelled of fear and sickness, and the nutrient paste that had made so many of them ill, and she saw small faces looking up at her from behind welded bars with eyes that were too old for their years. She stopped, and she removed her helmet so they could see a human face, and she knelt down so she was at their level, because the Hearthguard trained for this moment too, the moment after the fighting, when the real mission began. "My name is Amara," she said, and her voice cracked, despite everything she had been through, and everything she had trained for, because some things are bigger than training. "I am here to take you home. No one is ever going to hurt you again, I promise." A small girl with dried paint on her fingers and bruises on her arms looked at Amara for a long moment, and then reached through the bars and grabbed her hand, and Amara held it with the gentleness of someone cradling the most precious thing in the universe. Outside the complex, Kyth emerged from the underground tunnels into the daylight for the first time in days, blinking his 4 eyes against the sun. He stopped him where he stood. Human soldiers in full combat armor, massive figures bristling with weapons, and covered in the dust and scorch marks of battle, were carrying children out of the school complex. And they were carrying them the way humans carry their young, cradled against their chests, with arms that could crush metal, wrapped gently around small bodies. And the children were clinging to them, and some of the soldiers were crying behind their helmets, and none of them were ashamed of it. Kyth watched a man who was easily 2 meters tall and built like a warship hold a sleeping toddler against his shoulder with one hand, while his other hand still gripped a rifle. And the expression on the man's face was something that Kyth finally understood after 3 years of studying humans. The ferocity and the tenderness were not different things. They were the same thing. They had always been the same thing. In orbit, the last Zarathi warship went silent, and Warlord Draxen Vel was dragged from his shattered bridge in restraints and brought before a holographic link where Captain Ashcroft's face appeared, calm and quiet, and absolutely without mercy. "This was the fleet we sent for one colony," she said. "Imagine what comes if you ever do this again." Draxen Vel looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. The galaxy is a place of long memories, and what happened at Verdana V became a memory that no civilization would ever be allowed to forget. In the days after the battle, the human fleet remained in orbit like a wall of iron and light, and the soldiers on the ground secured every building and every street and every underground tunnel, until there was not a single Zarathi left on the surface who was not in restraints. The children were the first priority, because the children had always been the only priority. Medical ships arrived within hours of the battle's end, massive vessels with white hulls and green crosses that carried doctors and nurses and psychologists and specialists in childhood trauma, and they set up field hospitals in the very buildings where the Zarathi had held their command posts, because there was a certain justice in that. The youngest children were treated first, dehydration and malnutrition, and the sickness caused by the Zarathi nutrient paste that their bodies had never been meant to process, and the doctors worked with a quiet intensity that came from knowing exactly what they were fighting for. The older children were harder to help because their wounds were not all physical. Marcus, the 12-year-old who had been beaten for trying to organize food sharing among the younger kids, sat on a medical cot and stared at nothing for 3 days before a counselor named Dr. Elena Park sat down next to him and did not say a word and just sat there. On the 4th day, Marcus turned to her and said, "I tried to help them." And Dr. Park said, "You did help them, and you were braver than anyone should ever have to be." And Marcus cried for the first time since the invasion began. Lily, the 7-year-old with the paint on her fingers, asked Sergeant Diallo if she could have something to draw with, and Amara requisitioned art supplies from a transport ship with the same urgency she would have used for ammunition. And when Lily drew a picture of a woman in black armor with a kind face, and wrote the word hero underneath it, Amara had to leave the room, because there is only so much a person can hold inside themselves before it spills over. Director Okoye was freed from the labor camp where she had been held, and she walked through the colony that she had built, and she saw the damage and the scars, and the places where the Zarathi had torn apart what had taken years to grow. And she stood in the middle of the main plaza, and she closed her eyes, and she breathed, and then she opened them and said to the people who had gathered around her, "We will rebuild. We have done it before, and we will do it again. This place is ours, and it always will be." The colony did rebuild, not quickly, because real healing is never quick, but steadily, and with a stubbornness that the galaxy was beginning to recognize as one of humanity's defining characteristics. Within a standard year, the farms were producing again, and the school complex had been torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. Not repaired, but rebuilt entirely, because the children deserved a place that held no memory of cages. And the new school had wide windows and bright colors, and a garden in the center where Lily's painting hung in a frame on the wall of the main hallway. The Zarathi Dominion did not survive the aftermath. It was not that the humans came for them, because after Verdana 4, the humans did not need to fire another shot. The message had been delivered with a clarity that transcended language and species and culture. The galaxy had watched 200 human warships materialize out of the darkness for a single colony of 12,000 people, and every civilization with the ability to count understood what that meant. If the humans would send that much firepower for one colony, what would they send for two? What would they send for a city? What would they send for a world? Obvious, and it was terrifying, and it changed every calculation that every species had ever made about the balance of power in known space. The Zarathi Dominion's vassal states and client species, who had been held in line by fear for centuries, suddenly found their courage, because the thing they had feared most was no longer the Zarathi. It was the prospect of being on the wrong side when the humans came back. Rebellions broke out across Dominion space, one after another like fires catching in dry grass. And the Dominion, which had been built on the assumption that strength meant cruelty and that fear was the only reliable tool of governance, discovered that those foundations crumbled very quickly when something stronger appeared on the horizon. Within 18 months, the Zarathi Dominion fractured into a dozen squabbling territories, and warlord Draxen Vel's empire existed only in history books and cautionary tales. Draxen Vel himself was brought before the Galactic Council to stand trial for what the prosecution called crimes against a protected species developmental population, which was the formal way of saying he had hurt children. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the evidence was overwhelming, and included the footage from Kyth's cameras and testimony from the children themselves, given via recorded statements, because no one would make them face their captor in person. No one would do that to them. Draxen Vel stood in the defendant's platform, and he was diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the restraints he wore. He had entered the courtroom expecting to defend his actions as the legitimate exercise of military authority, and instead he found himself watching footage of a 7-year-old girl flinching at a loud noise, and a 12-year-old boy being struck for sharing food, and the courtroom was silent in a way that pressed against him from every direction. When the verdict came, it was unanimous across all 37 council species, which was only the 4th unanimous verdict in the council's 12,000-year history. He was sentenced to permanent imprisonment on a facility that orbited a dead star, where he would have a great deal of time to think about what he had done. As he was led away, he passed the human delegation, and he looked at Captain Ashcroft, who was seated in the gallery, and he stopped and asked her a question that had been eating at him since the moment his fleet was destroyed. "Why?" he said. "They were just children. They were not soldiers. They were not leaders. They were not strategically significant. Why did you come with everything you had for creatures that could not fight, and could not work, and could not do anything of value?" Ashcroft looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "That is why you lost, because you just told me you still do not understand, and if you cannot understand why children have value, then you were never going to win against a species that builds its entire civilization around protecting them. Draxen Vel had no answer for that. Kyth Soratal returned to Aori space after the trial, and he sat down in his study and he began to write. The document he produced over the following months became the most widely read xenological report in Galactic Council history, translated into over 400 languages and studied in academic institutions, military academies, and diplomatic training programs across known space. He called it The Guardian Threshold, Understanding Humanity's Response to Threats Against Their Young, and its central thesis was built on everything he had witnessed in his 3 years on Verdana 4, and the terrible days of the occupation, and the awesome and terrifying hours of the liberation. He wrote that most species in the galaxy protect their young out of biological imperative, a programmed response designed to ensure the continuation of genetic, material, functional, and logical, and limited by cost-benefit calculations that every species makes, whether they are aware of it or not. Humans, he argued, were fundamentally different. Humans protected their children out of something that went beyond biology and beyond logic and beyond any framework that xenological science had ever developed to categorize species behavior. He called it sacred fury, because those were the only words in any language he knew that came close to capturing what he had seen in the eyes of Sergeant Diallo, as she knelt before a cage full of frightened children and promised them that no one would ever hurt them again. It was a fury that bound every member of the human species into a single force, regardless of nationality, or culture, or personal belief. A fury that did not diminish with distance, or time, or the calculations of strategic value. A fury that burned with the intensity of love rather than hatred. Inexhaustible. To harm a human child, Kyth wrote, was not to attack an individual family or a single community. It was to declare war on the entire human race, across every border and every fleet and every generation. And the humans would come. They would always come, and they would not stop until the threat was ended, and the children were safe, and the galaxy had learned its lesson. The Galactic Council read the report, and they convened a closed session to discuss its implications. And after 3 days of debate, they did something unprecedented. They amended the official threat assessment classification for humanity. The old classification, Cooperative Mid-Tier Civilization, was deleted. In its place, they created a new category that had never existed before, and that was designed specifically and exclusively for one species: non-hostile apex guardians. The classification came with a footnote that was distributed to every military and diplomatic institution in Council space, and the footnote said simply, "Do not provoke, especially regarding their young." Years passed and the galaxy settled into a new understanding of itself, one in which humanity occupied a unique and somewhat unsettling position, the friendliest and most generous species most aliens had ever encountered, and simultaneously the most dangerous thing in known space when given a reason. New species made first contact, were briefed, were skeptical, and then met actual humans, and they were confused because the humans they met were warm and funny and brought food to diplomatic meetings and told jokes that did not translate well and seemed genuinely interested in learning about other cultures. And then they read Kyth's report, and they looked at the warm, funny humans with new eyes, and they understood that the warmth and the fury were not contradictions, but two expressions of the same extraordinary thing. On a bright morning many years after, Battle of Verdana 4, a newly contacted species called the Ilvari sent their first diplomatic envoy to meet with humanity. And the Ilvari ambassador, who had been extensively briefed by the Aori and the Tolari, and several other species who had all said variations of the same thing, sat across from a human ambassador named Dr. Yuna Hayashi and tried not to show how nervous he was. "Ambassador Hayashi," the Ilvari said carefully, "my government has asked me to inquire about human values and priorities so that we may build our relationship on a foundation of mutual understanding. If you would be willing, could you tell me what humans value most. Yuna Hayashi smiled, and the smile was warm and real, and reached her eyes in the way that only human smiles did. And she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small holographic projector, and activated it, and a tiny image appeared above her palm of a girl about 4 years old, with dark hair and bright eyes, and a gap-toothed grin. "This is my daughter May," Yuna said. "Everything we are, everything we build, everything we fight for, it is all for them." The Ylvari ambassador looked at the tiny holographic child, and then he looked at the woman holding the image, and he saw in her eyes something that was gentle and fierce and infinite, all at the same time, and he understood. On a quiet evening on Verdana 4, in a study filled with human books and Aori data crystals, and the accumulated observations of a lifetime spent trying to understand an impossible species, Kyth Soratal sat down and added the final entry to his personal journal. "I have studied 1,000 species," he wrote. "I have catalogued their wars and their empires and their philosophies. But I have never encountered a species that is simultaneously so gentle and so terrifying. Humans will share their food with strangers, and sing songs to creatures that cannot understand them, and weep over a flower that has no petals left. And in that contradiction, there is the core of their strength. But threaten their children, and they will burn the stars themselves to ash before they let you succeed. The galaxy has many apex predators, but it has only one apex guardian, and heaven help you if you give them a reason." He set down his stylus and looked out the window at the colony that had been destroyed and rebuilt, and was now more alive than it had ever been. And he watched the human children playing in the streets below, laughing and running and getting mud on their clothes. And he understood at last why the humans had come with everything they had. It was never about strategy or territory or power. It was about the laughter.